Well, it looks like many of us are here. Welcome back to our Department of Art Visiting Speaker Series. I'm very pleased to welcome Matt Saunders to join us to present his work, which is many of you have looked at, read about, and it is a uniquely developed interaction between painting and photography, abstraction and image making processes. We will have the opportunity to discuss the work with artists directly, to address thoughts and questions that might arise. After the talk, we'll have some time for questions from you, the audience. So we'll follow the same procedure as last week, where I ask that you enable your cameras now, but mute your mics during the talk, and then enable your mics after in order to ask any questions directly. And again, we'll just kind of make do. If anyone has any problems with their mic or anything, you can write into the chat, and just I'll try to keep my attention on that and help you out there. We also have the privilege this evening to have Professor Margaret Lee here joining us in welcoming our guest. Margaret Lee is a poet, scholar, new media artist, and author of the award-winning poetry collection Love, Robot, as well as the poetry chapbook Yellow and Radio Heart, or How Robots Fall Out of Love. Margaret Lee is a professor of media study here at UB and was recently a college fellow in digital practice at Harvard University, where she crossed paths with our visitor, Matt Saunders, who is on the faculty of Harvard's Department of Visual and Environmental Studies. We welcome you and thank you both for being here tonight. And we look forward to talking with you more as a group after the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Professor Goldfarb for inviting me to come and introduce artist Matt Saunders. And this is an amazing series, and it's always exciting to have media study and art collaborations. So thank you so much for that introduction, Max, and very happy to be here. So I am really pleased and honored to welcome Matt to UB, and I'll provide a brief introduction to Matt's work. However, given his expansive and very deeply compelling body of work and practice, we eagerly await and look forward to his artist talk that will delve more deeply in learning further about his interventions and his work. So, artist Matt Saunders is the Harris K. Weston Associate Professor of the Humanities, Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Art, Film and Media and Visual Studies at Harvard University. As an artist of multiple forms, yet trained in painting, Saunders draws upon and transgresses across mediums, such as photography, printmaking, and animation, producing provocative, experimental, and innovative artworks that questions our notions of the visual. Saunders, in his practice, is known to combine painting and darkroom photography, also grappling with evocative subject matter, such as forgotten film star muses, and his work prompts questions on presence and absence, and collapsing time and space through his practice. So painter and critic Rob Colvin describes Saunders' work, quote, canvas, oil paint, mylar, and related media, what in other hands might be framed and put on a wall, become the negatives through which our light is passed onto photographic paper, unquote. So these insights on light actually bring to mind how the wavelengths, like the properties of light, while it may not be detected by human eyes, however, light as defined makes something possible, like to be visible, to be seen. So this possibility, this metaphor of light, I think helps us understand the multi-dimensions of Saunders' interventions in his interdisciplinary practice. Saunders' artwork has been shown widely in solo and group exhibitions, including the Renaissance Society, the Tate, Tank Space, Museum of Modern Art, Whitney Museum, Mass MoCA, and the St. Louis Art Museum, alongside numerous gallery shows at Bloom and Poe and Miriam Goodman Gallery, where he is represented. He's a recipient of numerous awards, including a Tiffany Foundation grant and the De Cordova Rappaport Prize. In addition to his artwork, Saunders also teaches innovative courses such as critical painting, which draws from the lens of art history, and he also teaches studio classes, such as what I think is really fabulously titled Painting Stout. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Matt in regards to his practice. He earned his AB from the Department of Visual and Environmental Studies in 1997 and his MFA from Yale in 2002, and spent many years living and working in Berlin, which informs his work. And in addition to his teaching and artistic practice, Saunders also contributes as a writer with very incisive critiques and reviews of contemporary art to Artforum, with writing on Agnes Martin, Amy Silman, and even the paintings of George W. Bush. So I'm so pleased to welcome Matt to campus, and as Max mentioned, I had the pleasure of meeting and working with Matt on campus at Harvard, and it is such an honor and pleasure to welcome him here to UB, even digitally. So please help me welcome Matt Saunders. Yay.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. And thank you, Max, for having me, and hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so disappointed not to be there. I wanted to just say how much I was looking forward to coming and seeing the program there. I've heard, of course, so much over the years about the media program and the growing, I've also heard incredible things about the art program, and was really, really curious. So I feel incredibly stymied to be in this format. I saw some great studios today, and I wish I could see more of your work. I'm going to see if I can get this to start to play. Let's see. All right. So I rely on you, on someone to shout out or text me if things are going awry. I put together a slightly informal talk actually tonight, because in a way I wanted to compensate for the strangeness of being so far away by being quite open. I went back to some very ancient work that I would not normally show, because I had, usually my work is really multidisciplinary, and I sort of organize my talks in different ways. Given the contexts and the sort of relationship to thinking about media in Buffalo and the depth of that thinking, which you almost be encountering in some way, I thought I would try to ask a question of really what does it mean to have a practice in which you consider painting to be a form of media? What if we think of painting through the lens of other types of media, specifically moving media, which I think is one way of looking at my work. Just to give you a taste before I start to kind of parse it, I'm going to do my talk non-chronologically, so it's going to jump around a little bit. But this is what a show of mine might look like. This is a show I did at the Tate, I don't know, 7 years ago. I often am showing things that are scaled like paintings, feel like paintings, might not be technically paintings. These are large silver gelatin prints, black and white prints. The work is often figurative, very strong figurative trajectory in the work, although it's equally frequently abstract, has a very strong relationship to articulations of processes, this specificity about materials. Oops, somehow I've gotten off of my, are you just getting a beep like I am?
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go. I think I've somehow gotten into, there we go. Something going strange with my full screen share. Also very serial. So I'm working back and forth between different materials, figuration, abstraction, but also often working in large series processes that develop in very open-ended ways. And so I guess the first question I want to ask is, what do we think of painting not as an act of representation, but an act of perception? What if painting as a lens is a media through which to observe the world? Now, anybody who's painted has started with plein air painting, painting from life. So I'm going to leave that aside because I feel like we all know something about that. and proposed that one thing painting can do is look at other media, time-based media. And so what is it when a painting is observing a moving image? This is something, this goes back to, this is work of mine from before graduate school, where I was living in New York. I was obsessed with the, so please forgive this painting, I mean, but obsessed with the early painting, the late films of Andy Warhol, the scripted films, the strange films where he doesn't even show up for the shoot, and these moments of sort of extreme performativity. And these, in this case, it's Joe D'Alessandro in a very uncomfortable situation in the middle of the film Trash, starting to shave and relax and see himself. And I felt like in that moving image, there was something happening in the musculature of his face, happening in these engagement with self-regard that that I was seeing going by over and over and over again. So I was sort of making these paintings, trying to capture those moments, or treat painting like this kind of diaristic reason to look at things in certain ways in time. Also thinking about it as an incredibly mannered and incredibly stiff type of activity. So at once diaristic, at the other hand, very formal. And so I was also making these drawings based upon production stills, publicity stills of the sorts of movies I was watching. This is jumping ahead some time, but it really was a transition point in my work from watching films, taking images off the film and using these still photographs as sources for paintings, to doing things like these animation projects where I started to be involved in drawing as a way to kind of get underneath the hood of the material itself. So this was a sequence where I was fascinated by a passage of film from the very beginning of the very first film of an actor I was looking at a lot those days, where his face is coming into focus. And I was interested in this for a number of questions of translation. Like there's the frame I had up earlier, I'm not gonna risk trying to, oh, let's go backwards. You know, I was working with these drawing materials which had very sharp edges. I'm using oil and mylar. And so how do you come up with an analogous type of mark for an out of focus camera? How do you do out of focus in drawing and not just in a kind of transcription of the blur, the Richter blur? It was a project of trying to draw a 15-second passage of film in all 600 and some of its frames. And I tried showing them as drawings for a second, didn't like that, put that back as a moving image. So I ended up with this practice of animation that was really about thinking about the specific materiality of the moving image itself and using drawing as a way to sort of get inside of it to unpack it and put it back together. This has jumped forward to some of my most recent work that I still use this approach of starting with something you're interested in, trying to make it by hand in some way, and then seeing how the space that opens up inside of that is a way of seeing that object itself. So these are a series of tests. These are actually not works, but what you're looking at here, it's a painting I made of a lily pond that I took off the stretcher and crumpled and folded and treated like a kind of mobile surface, like a sort of surface of water or surface of a film screen, and used to make these photograms in the darkroom. The technique of this will become clear as I get further into the work, but I hope that that's makes sense what I'm saying there, where I'm saying that I'm trying to trouble the materiality of perception by looking not with the eyes, but with trying to take that through a cycle of working, and then the way that that lets you get your hand on that kind of perception, on seeing. This is a still from a very recent animation, which again, I think is very much about a kind of moving image, which is slipping away from us, constantly coming in out of focus and flexing at the seams, and how through the activity of hand making an image, not rephotographing it exactly, because I feel like there's a kind of fixed sequence of stages that you see there, but actually taking it apart, you can start to challenge your ability to see the image. You can do kind of archaeology on the image. And you, of course, can hopefully confront the viewer with an unstable kind of image that they struggle to process, and then come to have a different type of relationship with, a non-superficial relationship. Are you all with me? Sorry, I feel like I'm kind of headlong in Nod if you.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. Closer to my heart really is this question of pictures and materials being inseparable, and being interested in places in which the image is really embodied in its physicality. And again, just to be, since I know a lot of you are students, just to be very self-revealing, this is student work. This is my end work in graduate school. But I was making these big paintings where I was priming the canvas in different ways. I was working with kind of restaged performances, and this is from a very obscure German film. And then painting in this way where the material and the image were running in different directions. In that painting, parts that I showed you before, parts of the painting were soaked into the canvas, parts of them were really thick on the surface. And although it sort of flattens out and combines in the slideshow, in person, it's a very disjunctive painting. And I was sort of thinking of how far those scenes could push apart. Or paintings like this from around my first shows, where I was working on mylar, I was working on plastic, and I was really thinking about where the image is located in a screen. So these are paintings. In this case, it's still from a Fassbinder film that I was interested in. But here you can probably see in this image, the one figure is painted on the back of this frosted mylar, the other figure is painted very thickly on the front. And so when you encounter this in person, it has a kind of presence of separation and a kind of location of the image in the space between these two layers that are coming together that's different from a simple, straightforward image. And this was my original idea, I guess, of what I thought painting could do with images, that painting could render images physical in troubled ways. After some years of working, I end up in a space where I'm working with different sets of materials. I'm still working with the mylar, but again, these are paintings based on different sources and photos, but I'm painting on both sides of the mylar, but I'm separating it now between what I think of as the image and what I think of as the screen. And I'm using this calligraphy ink that I'm remixing to create this kind of silver surface. So these are two images of the same painting photographed under different lighting. And it was again this impulse to try to think about how you could make a painting that couldn't be photographed, that couldn't be separated out from its materiality, in which the painting itself was a kind of transmitter, or kind of a binder between different layers of information that could hold those together. In all of this, I think really of this as kind of juvenilia. You know, this is work that looks very embarrassing to me now, but it's work in which I was parsing out the ways that these traditional materials could kind of get under the surface of media culture, or kind of allow me to think about the streams of images and celebrity and things like this that I was engaged with. This is a detail just showing the strange physicality of these things, that they end up being gloopy and sticky and shiny and reflective. And they felt like a kind of a way of working in analog, a way of sort of trying to translate painting, not as a way of representing something again, but as a way of kind of finding ways to transform qualities of distance, say, or of illumination into certain material gestures that could kind of play as independent players in these very sort of separated paintings. I skipped that by accident. At the same time, I was thinking about my moving image work and moving forward with these animations, and really again thinking about where they were located. So medium is never neutral. I'm working back and forth between video and 16mm film. And this is an example of a two-screen piece that I showed in New York in 2006, 2007, which was based on a short section of film, basically two still images, two moments in a film where nothing's really happening, and then drawing those still images as many times as I could bear. So I basically am creating the time, creating the space through the expansion of this still moment, and then reconstituting back as this film strip. And it was shown in this way where you would see the film strip long before you saw the projection. I won't bore you with the details of that, but the idea that you encounter the image in its kind of native materiality before you see its performativity as a projection on the wall. And this is really when I started working with photography. So now maybe the work begins, let's say, which is realizing that if I make a painting like this monochrome painting on the left, which is transparent in some ways, and I put light through it, it can expose the photo paper. It can function just to make a photogram, just to make a simple print of the painting, a sort of silk screen with light. And in a way that did a number of things for me. It got my gestures kind of under the surface of that skill in photography. It let me think about scale, about blowing up from small drawings, about creating a painting or drawing which functions as a kind of tool. But anyway, like arriving at this kind of hybrid space where these marks, these materialities are continue to be present in the object, but they have gone through this kind of transformation through the projecting of the photo light. And so they maintain a feeling of the materiality, they maintain a kind of indexicality. This is where I really want to point at the screen, but this is, for instance, a contact print made from a painting in which the areas you see which are white are very thick paint, the light doesn't get through. I'm kind of learning to paint very, very thinly with these, but it's a stretched painting. You see the stretcher bar. You see, of course, the grid of the canvas, and the painting itself becomes just a tool to make something else, that you are creating potential energy, and then you are using this to kind of explore the potential for that image to go in different places. This is a painting that surprised me, where I made this painting on the left, printed with it, tried to remake it on a thicker canvas, and ended up with this kind of corrosive image where those black spots that you're seeing are actually minuscule pinholes in the canvas that I couldn't see with my naked eye, but the light catches. The exposure time for that print to be made was about 3 hours. And in that time, that light found its way through those holes and created a kind of other version of that. You know, it revealed something about that image that I hadn't seen. And so I'm starting to work in these pairings between these different materials, putting them together in complicated ways, but then building exhibitions around those types of investigations. So this was, installation shot of my show at the Renaissance Society, where I was putting together prints just pinned directly on the wall, trying to think of the whole idea of an exhibition as a kind of test site for an encounter between different ideas and different materials. And maybe I won't say much more about these, but this is kind of an expansion of where that series went into these different types of photograms working. I was interested for a while in these sort of surveillance images, and went through linen catalogs and got, this is a very, very thin, a kind of ecclesiastical linen, like a church linen that has this structure in it, and working with the fabric itself as this kind of variable that can translate into a kind of visual space of pixelation and observation, working with the strangeness of flexing depth of focus, flexing the thickness of the materiality, going back and forth between the kind of liquidity of photochemistry. Some of these I'm putting into a tray with no chemistry, and I'm pouring the chemistry in the tray. Some of them I'm treating very straightforwardly, but basically expand into this long series of kind of investigating what would happen between silver gelatin prints and drawings and paintings. I think you can see the difference between the painting on fabric, which I was doing before, to these ones which are back to drawing with ink on mylar. And then, of course, the way that that itself becomes, I want to say, estranged or surprising, that in engaging with the way that the photo would capture or scan or kind of x-ray the paintings, you start to see the paintings through other criteria, through opacity and transparency. Color is reduced to those other variables. And then things like the structure of the canvas get come forward as markers of scale, as a kind of a re-revelation of some of the kind of basic structures that you tend to see through when looking at work. This, and I know this is moving kind of underneath, but I just am saying on that line of thought of how things are embodied, I think that I've moved more into printmaking, and this is a fairly recent series of large copper etchings that I've done with soap ground, which is a kind of time release ground. It's a ground that's somewhat water soluble, so it starts to come up in the acid, so it functions kind of like a photo developer and lets me make these sort of handmade double exposures where I'll draw two different images over top of each other, put them in the acid, it starts to eat through, it starts to change, and you kind of pull them out and work on them. Create these large images, but at the same time, the whole time you're working, you're also dealing with this copper plate. So this is a piece that is an addition. It's a set of prints, but the prints are printed both front and back. And so in a way, the piece is articulating both the conscious image, which I'm looking at while I'm making it, but it's also capturing all of the wear and tear and all the process and all the sort of information that's going into the materiality of the copper that is being dragged around the studio, and using the press as a way to pull that information off the plate. Or these prints, which are even newer, which are made by making watercolor drawings on a piece of linen, and then putting that linen on a half of a piece of wet paper, folding the paper over the linen and running it through the press. The press pulls out the watercolor. So it's a way of using the linen as a matrix for this monoprint, but then printing both sides of the same thing at once. And when the thing crosses that margin, when the thing flips and gets folded by the fold itself, then there's a real inseparability there between the image and the materials. I hope that makes some sense. I was just compressing a couple lines of thought there. But I would also, like to have a conversation in the Q&A maybe about the way in which painting itself can be considered to be a time-based media, and a media which can both function as a space to be anachronistic, a space to ruminate about time, a space to sort of to think about these multiplicities of timelines. This is my very first show in New York ages ago now, which was based upon this idea of the stock shot of people sleeping and making a kind of shared collective space of sleep with all of these paintings, which were made with oil on mylar, to the way that working sequentially in the way that I do also becomes a way in which an image changes over time. And the way that that image changes or transforms can be an articulation of progress or lack of progress or circulation or recirculation of imagery. So this is, for instance, two prints. Sorry, it's now 7 o'clock in New York, so we're going to get the appreciation noise out the window, which is great. But these are prints, made putting light through a canvas onto silver gelatin paper, but exposing multiple sheets of paper, just exposing, and then developing them, turning on the lights, like letting that kind of ongoing processional engagement with an image be a kind of narrative that unfolds around it. And I'll often show work in ways that preserve those types of sequences. Paintings, of course, also have times, have a relationship to time that's completely out of your control. This is a kind of erratic object in my practice for me, and that's part of a group of work that encountered Hurricane Sandy. And so I had a series of these works that were based on sort of liquidity and a movement of water that got flooded, and I managed to get them back. And so I've also considered, painting as something which goes into the world and has a life of its own, and then can kind of come back and have that damage, have that experience. It's very hard to talk to you without any feedback and this information here. And I, of course, have worked with moving image. This I should should have made a disclaimer about the flashing. This is a fragment of a short animation just to give you a sense of what those animations look like. But I really have done a lot of work which takes the process of drawing, which I talked about earlier as one of kind of getting inside of the fragment of moving image, and moved it into a kind of architecturally based, space-based articulation of orchestrating multiple experiences of movement and time and engagement and sort of, as I said earlier, perception across all sides of an exhibition space. So this is, a view of the show at the Tate, but more typically, I've installed these things in, on the sides of buildings, in large halls, in multi-channel installations. And when I do this, I often am using these formats and these materials of painting very self-consciously to sort of propose these screens as kind of activated moving paintings, but also to bring out their materiality, to bring out the way in which the screen itself can be the canvas itself can be the screen, and these things can get into these complicated dialogues. So I'm using the actual canvas material that, say, I'm using to make the paintings as these projection screens, passing the light through them. And so what you see on the wall is maybe a version of what would be captured by the photo paper. You have this kind of opening up of a kind of coherent dialogue between these different ways of thinking about the life cycle of an image and where it happens to encounter its visibility. When I spoke earlier about wanting to think about painting as a kind of tool, what's liberating about that for me is keeping open the contingency, keeping open the idea that you finish your work in one mindset, in one sort of way of working, and then that thing just becomes something that can generate multiplicity, it can generate a shift of focus, it can be rethought. And so I've always reached for these ways of trying to keep the process always moving kind of in a kind of continuation of that open potential energy. So the refresh rate of these animations, the way that they cycle back through certain images, I think is related to some articulation of the kind of studio process that you feel when you're in the darkroom with these types of materials. And of course, I'm fascinated by these types of longer cycles. This is a show I did in Tokyo where the gallery was dominated by this large window that's in a very busy part of town. There's this view onto a shrine that always, every experience I had of seeing work from that space, the work was trumped by the view. So I realized I couldn't cover the window and I couldn't compete with the window. So I tried to make the window part of the cycle of the work. So it was this multi-screen projection in which the window itself was considered to be the light source, or the sort of third screen in the projection. So the cycle of the show ended up being this kind of 24-hour cycle that we kept going, using the light to transform the space. And also using the light of the projector to transform the possibility of an image. This is a color photo that's made the same way as the black and white photos. So I am making a painting. I am putting a piece of photo paper up on the wall in the dark. I'm hanging the canvas of the painting, which I've unstretched in this case, in front of it. And I'm shining light through it. And in the case of color photography, of course, all the colors flip, everything goes to negative, but it's a really, really straightforward kind of analog process. But what it lets you do is play with the movement and the kind of contingency that can come up in that fleeting moment. So in a case like this is a kind of basically black and white painting, and I'm adding the color by holding up little drawings on colored glass in front of the projector to add these kind of passages of color as independent elements that drift across the surface of the painting. And so they end up being these objects which are kind of contact prints of paintings. They're kind of paintings that have moved into being a photo, but at a certain point they become inseparable, and they become these strange, I used the word hybrid earlier and I'll return to it here, they become these things that can't exist one without the other. And I'm really interested in this extending, I'd say, kind of the future, the kind of relevance and the potentiality of something like a practice of painting through inventing forms, not to try to make something necessarily completely new, but to arrive at a kind of uncertainty or a kind of instability in the looking at the part of the viewer. And this is something that you experience as a maker yourself. This was the moment for me right before I started using color photo paper and sort of troubleshooting and figuring out how to do this with the materials of color. But I was using black and white materials, but pulling them out partway through the bath. And if you've worked with black and white analog printing, and I realize that the older I get and the more I talk about this work, how foreign that may probably sound to a lot of people, but the colors shift. So painting, a piece like this, which is supposed to be completely black and white, because of the way that I'm changing the temperature of the water, I'm interrupting the chemistry and then restarting the chemistry, starts to open up the way that these blacks are never black, and that they're going into all this other kind of space. And I was very fascinated by that sense of the kind of unexpected counterproductivity of that the black and white thing will open up into a kind of color, and that things can exist in this very middle place between things. This went directly into this work, which obviously has a very different kind of color space to it, but these are my very first tests with making color prints, and you can see I'm still really figuring out like what the kind of color space of color photography is. And it's a very different type of color space to painting. The way we map painting through pigments and through a kind of scale that's based on pigment-based looking is very different from the spectral thinking and the way that you see color or grade color in photography. So the first thing I had to deal with was naturalism, was could I make paintings of the body that became body-like or had a relationship to a kind of naturalistic way of thinking. So these are really sort of getting to learn how I could make, say, a skin tone, or how I could be in control of the kinds of colors. So again, this is a picture that's made by making a painting, in this case on a kind of thick woven canvas. The painting itself is blue and kind of orange. The skin is blue. And then I hang it up against the wall and I put light through it. In this case, I let it hang. And so I let the painting itself have a kind of body and behave in this other sort of strange way. Or I treat it super matter-of-factly. I think about this painting based on an out-of-focus portrait. So the painting itself is kind of out of focus. And then thinking of the thickness of the canvas and the sort of distance between the front and the back of the canvas as the degree of out of focus that the photo is going to have. So it's just laying the canvas on top of the photo paper and letting that kind of, those two things come into contact and sort of open up in that way. This was a type of space where I really got involved with landscape. I really got involved with thinking about naturalism and luminosity and the relationship of these things to color. In a way, one of the things that's happening is that I'm using paint to block light. And so I'm working with a kind of liquid vocabulary of light. I'm working with a kind of a facture of light, and became very interested in the way that the physicality of the painting could translate into distress, transformation, and the kind of luminosity or the potential for a kind of mobility or transformative quality of an image itself. Don't worry, I'm getting towards wrapping up here. At the same time, I've veered towards showing you more figurative and landscape work because it tends to translate, but I'm exploring this also through these abstractions, where I'm thinking about how you can make an abstract painting through these materials. I'm making multiple layers of drawings, which are different focal planes, and letting these print these big photographs. These are kind of quite large, as you can see, and thinking about this as a kind of practice of abstract painting, which in some ways, as I said, is really just transcribing the materiality. And that can get into a kind of, kind of a super indexical picture space, whether you're indexing the thread of the canvas, whether you are playing with, I keep using the word potential energy, but playing with the space between a canvas and a photo. This is an example of what happens when you take the same negative and you put it against the wall flat, and it has contact all across the plane with the photo paper, versus when you allow it to move, and thinking of the photo as a space where you can make an image of the air inside of an image, or of the fragment of time in which the image is coming into being, and how that type of visualization, that type of object, has a kind of feeling towards the strangeness of becoming that you have in the studio with painting, like keeping that moment alive. And at the same time, of course, something that in the lens becomes a blur is much more complicated than a blur, I think, in real life. Yeah. These are some examples of tossing canvases around, letting them fold and flutter, and then how those things get put together into a show that combines paintings, photographs, and these large-scale animations in something that really, I think, tries to ask people to question the materiality of everything they're looking at, and then what type of headspace is that. The last thing I want to talk about is contents, other ways in which I think painting can be a kind of analytic and an engaged tool on the world around us, whether it's simply something as straightforward as making a painting of a subject. This is a painting on chiffon where I'm sort of squeegeeing, I'm kind of sucking up. I work on the painting and then I pour turpentine on the palette, and I try to mop up the palette with the paintings. The painting doesn't have any waste. It's like an eco-friendly, completely recycled painting. And then of course it starts to sort of push against itself and get into this, these different layers in the paintings. But from very early on, I've always had a very research-based approach to work. And of course, when you think about research with photography, you think about the archive. So I think one of my main projects from 10 plus years ago was this archive project around the life of a particular actress, in which I gathered all these materials from this woman, Herta Thiele's public presence. This was an actress who had several roles in her 20s, and then didn't act for 30 some years and came back. And I was very interested in this gap and this kind of visibility of somebody. And so these are obviously very early for me kind of photo works where I'm making drawings of these negatives. But what I essentially did was create an image art, create a negative archive through hand drawing it, and then use these to make these exhibitions that were about a kind of ersatz or kind of transformed or kind of alienated picture gallery. So, and the scale of paintings in kind of dialogue with portrait paintings, but thinking about what a kind of mediated portrait of somebody could be, through going back through every image I could find of her, remaking all those images by hand, and then having these tools to then generate portraits, to print the paintings of her. Another way in which I want to say that painting has a lot of kind of media contact is that it's such a genre, it's such a contextual thing, it's such a networked thing. So this is just an image of a show that I did in St. Louis, the museum in St. Louis, where I was able to do this project show in the galleries versus having a kind of black box, and doing that on purpose so that not only do you build these relationships across sequences of a figure, but you're able to sort of engage contextually with, you know, in this case, St. Louis Art Museum has Richter's Betty in the background there. And to think about painting as being part of a broader network conversation of internal dialogues between change and transformation, and then contextual dialogues. This was an abstract painting that was made about a Joan Mitchell painting that was in the sightline behind it. And then, well, these are more abstract paintings from the series. And then the way that a show itself can build up layers upon layers of kind of contextual material. And this is a recent show I did, which were, you know, layering paintings and photo prints on top of other paintings and photo prints in this way that kind of runs like multiple frames of kind of multiple dialogues going on top of each other, crossing over each other. And so at this moment, I'm really interested in all the different spaces that these kind of juxtapositions and these overlapping frames of painting and mark making and working across and inside of these material can create. My current fixation is back on a kind of time-based thinking, and these are the things that I've been working on a little bit last year, and then especially in the last couple of months in COVID, because I can make them in my bathtub, which are these resist drawings, where I'm taking sheets of photo paper and I'm starting to work on them with oil paint, drawing directly, drawing from my imagination, these figures turning in space, kind of question, you know, in this case, really thinking about intimacy and engagement with these bodies. And then I take the photo paper with the oil paint on it and I put it into a bath of photochemistry, which starts to turn the paper black, but only where the chemistry can touch the paper. And so the resist to the oil paint, which of course starts to lift off and change over time, makes the image. So you're engaged in this kind of like, it's like you start the egg timer ticking, and then the space, it opens up into this really strange kind of space that unfolds and develops over time that gets out of control, and you have to get into a kind of dialogue with that. And so, I don't know, when I was putting the talk together, I thought that would be a good place to end because it was my newest work, but also to say that what that really points to is that I want to insist that the most profound thing maybe that painting can do for us is that it can be a practice of like unknowing and instability and real time. And one of the things that has been consistent in my work is a fascination with these figures of distance, of self-invention, of obscurity, of gender ambiguity. If you'd spoken to me 15 years ago, we would have talked all about gender. And that not just representing those things, but finding a way to create a vocabulary in which the materials themselves are also being put into this kind of transformed and shifting and elusive relationship, to me is the reason why you would pick up on material in the first place. Because you can always make a picture with anything. And there are wonderful ways to make pictures, but at least in my work, I've picked up painting and photography and dialogue as this way to kind of insist on a kind of politics of disorientation and sense the importance of an instability and asking people to come to images and have to work to see what they are, and then be in multiple spaces at the same time, be in multiple types of imagery. And so, although my work has tended towards certain subjects and certain, kind of very media time-based, ways of doing things, I can hope that anyone who's making images can understand that images, when they're treated not as kind of simple chisels to make the thing in stone, can get into very complicated and kind of relational interactions with their subject matters, which of course will be our identities and the identities and experiences and conditions of everyone to come. So how did I end on that note? That was totally off-lived. I guess I feel like things are so depressing now that I wanted to say that I do believe that although I think what I'm trying to leave you with is that although I gave a sort of roundabout and rough riding talk about all of these formal and technical things about how one is working, I think that when one works in ways in which the outcome is embedded in the process and is continually being kind of reactivated by the process, that you can get into these types of images and types of practices that can be capacious enough to actually engage the world around us and not just represent the already represented. And that would be the way in which, yeah, that'd be my sort of manifesto. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I feel like that was kind of a mess. That was an attempt to do a talk in a different order and not have any notes. So please, let's talk about questions you might have, things that aren't clear.
Thank you. Can you hear me? No, it didn't come across as a mess. It was amazing to see such powerful, inventive, experimental work with painting. I want to give everybody who would like to have a chance to talk to you directly. I guess maybe I just make one comment. I was just so interested in how, it's not really a question, I guess, but I was just interested in how kind of early kind of origins of painting and photography competing towards representational likenesses, and how your work much, cut to, whatever century later, after painting went into all kinds of channels of idiosyncratic abstraction and kind of reinventing other things beyond just representation likeness, you're really fusing photography and painting and other things as well, in a way, experimental processes, printmaking, and it seems like generally your work is with images is in service of something that's more than just a visible document. Again, just interested in that dynamic, embracing that kind of the relationship between those different modes.
We all know about the experience of like encountering, I guess this is the aura, blah, 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 but I've always really believed in the body for painting, but I've always been super bored by the additive approach of like, you make a mark, you make a mark, you make a mark until the picture is finished. But I always felt like so much less, well, yeah, it just wasn't my thing. But so I was always searching for a way of painting that would have a really specific kind of embodiment that couldn't be anything but a body in the world with us, that could sort of have that uncanny encounter that you get when you see something that has real presence. And yet, for myself, wanted something that could move forwards and backwards while you were working on it. And I think that coming up, I struggled to find painting in my generation at first that I was excited about, but I really connected in the 90s when I was a student to a lot of moving image practices. There was a kind of moment of expanded cinema and also a re-interest in the origins of photography. I feel like that was what you referenced, that was like coming up for people. And so that's really what influenced me. Yeah. Your comment makes a lot of sense to me. Then thank you for it.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for my distraction. I'm just also, there's a lot of activity that people are sort of raising points in the chat, and I want to make sure that they have a chance to speak as well. So let's do that if that's okay with you, Matt.
Please.
Let's hear from the audience.
Hi, I have a question. I was just like very curious as to like what inspired you to work with oil on Mylar in the first place,
I was drawing on Mylar because I loved the way the ink moved on the Mylar. I loved the sense that you would put the mark down and then it would take some time to dry so you could coax it. That it wasn't just your mark, it was like your mark and then it's moving and then you have to deal with it. And I loved drawing by, with your breath. So yeah, I was painting on canvas and drawing on Mylar, and then it was really natural to start painting on the Mylar. In retrospect, it looks so much like a screen. It was kind of like a no-brainer, but it was really more that it was what I had around, and then I found that the way it held the pigment was different. It's like slick, it slides, but you can also buff it in. You could actually make these like clouds of pigment by rubbing it in and wiping it off and leaving the stain, and that idea of like, I don't know, also, I loved it as materials and the double-sidedness and everything like that.
Thank you.
I have a question. When you showed your earlier works from when you were a student, which I love, by the way, because I just love seeing the progress of works artists mature. You pointed out that the first one that you kind of showed was this drawings and paintings of like this 15-second film that you just did over and over to capture that like focus. How do you progress from that to then just subject matter and just like playing with materials like you have been? Like are you still thinking about films in that way when you're like painting and then transferring that paint to a photographic image then, or are you just choosing subjects at random just to play with the color?
I'm not choosing them at random, but I've been doing this for long enough that I think I've probably gone every direction. Those early paintings, I was like trained. I was like an abstract painter. I was an earnest abstract painter, and I was living in New York, and I was really lonely, and I was house sitting in the East Village. And so those Warhol sources were actually, I was going to Mondo Kim's, if anyone remembers this video store in St. Mark's Place, and just going down the aisle, just renting everything that connected to that space I was living in, and playing them on the television, playing the VHS tapes on the TV to keep myself company while I was painting. And I'm sure you all know this, that you can have, we have these moments where we are connecting to a moving image as much as we're connecting, more sometimes than we're connecting to people. I am answering your question, I think we're in a roundabout way, but I felt like there were these elusive things going on in that videotape that I wanted to capture, but I didn't have a computer to just pause it. So I had a Polaroid camera, which of course is also a blunt instrument. So I was kneeling in front of the TV and trying to capture these images with this Polaroid. And there was something really alive about that experience of like stalking the thing that couldn't be seen or was happening in time and trying to make a still. And I felt like that engagement was articulating something quite honest about my experience of the moving quality of those images. So when I did the animation of 15 seconds, that was like a few years later. And I had started to like be working from stills from so much that I had lost some connection to the basic like elusive time-based quality of that original document. And I was thinking, I'm fascinated by this moment where somebody becomes visible, but I can't tell you which frame it happens in. It's like 15 seconds and it's a thing, and it's a discrete thing. It's one shot, it's one object, but it's not just a still. And so I set out to draw every frame of it in a way to try to hold on to it. It was like if I paused on every single frame and made a drawing at every frame, maybe I would see where it happened. So there was something about just like treating the block of time like it was an object that was there. And then of course, like I get into thinking about somebody's 30-year career and thinking about somebody's lifetime as an object, and how do you make a portrait of somebody's lifetime and not just of them? And I don't know, maybe I didn't answer your question, but I think it sort of evolved from trying to get my hands on time in a really like, excited and elusive way into having a practice. And then when you have a practice, then the work starts to have this kind of history, and you start to make decisions more based on like reacting to what you're unsatisfied with. I've stopped trying to give the artist talk where you're like, I did this, I did this. But if I were to do that chronological talk, every slide would be like, I hated this about what I just did. Or when I saw this on the wall, I realized it missed this. And so like that kind of reaction to what you don't have is then what moves it forward. So it keeps moving through different ideas and different subjects.
So then that moment that you're describing, do you feel like you ever caught it?
No, no. You know, in a way, it's like trying. I guess I talked about that moment of becoming in the painting studio, and I guess that is kind of my drug, that I had developed this practice where the work sometimes happens in a fraction of a second. And the way I work in the darkroom is I don't try to judge. I tend to make hundreds of prints because I know that they will look different to me when I see them for, you know, time in the studio. So I work like, I try to work faster than I can think. Or I try to do things like with I didn't show you much of this work, but I have a lot of work where I'm painting the photochemistry so that I'm rushing to do it. And in those works, it became a kind of choreography where I was working on these big pieces of paper, kind of my size, in a flat tray on the ground. And I would make these gestures with a broom or a big brush and a bucket full of chemistry, and something would happen. But by the time it starts to develop, it's too late. It's happening. So those works became really meditative for me because I had to learn with my body what the rhythm was for the work. I knew, like, you would start to hone in on what you wanted to have happen, and you would do it over and over again until you got it right. So it really became like sports of practice and thinking, or kind of feeling it with your choreography and not with your eyes anymore. And I think that that is somehow akin to like that moment of trying to understand what's moved you in a second.
Thank you.
Yeah, you get me talking, I'll go on and on. So I'll cut myself off.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So since you work with so many different mediums, what does your studio look like? Is it primarily paints or film stuff?
That's a very good question. They got split by accident. I was invited to come and I was living in Berlin where I had my dark room, and I was invited to come and teach. So I just went to Boston with a suitcase, and then I would make paintings in Boston and then roll them up like by the dozen and take them back to Germany over Thanksgiving and print. And I've maintained that separation. So my studio looks like a painting studio,
Mm-hmm.
but I got, you know, I don't know what you have. Our university and every university in Boston has thrown out their color darkroom. And so I actually have like invested in building a color darkroom for myself. But it's a totally separate space. So I kind of go back and forth. They're across the river from each other, and I kind of bike with canvases across, and somehow that's become my ritual. But no, it would look like a painting studio. The only difference would be that I buy all of my materials like from, I'm always seeking out the most diaphanous and strangest linen. And so I have a lot of weird boxes of things from like, yeah, like the Catholic Church, you know, from fabric companies that supply tablecloths and things like that. There's a lot of trial and error.
Gotcha. That's really cool that you keep them generally separated. Does that help you with, I feel like a lot of them are kind of straddling being film and being painting. In my head, I imagined you having one big studio where you would put everything together. So does it aid your process creatively to have two separate spaces?
Yeah, I find it really generative because I don't trust myself, and I don't trust my voice. Like part of this is about like it's like trying to throw something in the air and catch it. I mean, you catch it a little differently, so your grip shifts. And I feel like it's important to have something like that in your own practice. And so for me, when I had the studios in Berlin, I had them next, like in the same studio, divided in half. And I would like make a test print and then walk next door and make a mark and make a test print. And I was getting really finicky. And so I found it really liberating to do your best to work on the painting, and you have all these expectations. But I find that if I make 10 paintings, the 2 or 3 that I think are going to be awesome never work. They're always terrible, or they do strange things. And so there's this way of like, not like knowing that you don't know the potential of the work until you try to actually work with it. And that separation has helped me surprise myself, and into process of like first being surprised, and then secondly, like maybe the painting doesn't do what you wanted it to do, and then how do you problem solve that? Some of the, I mean, to be totally candid, some of the out of focus things and some of the like folding and throwing and like material things are about paintings where there are passages I don't like, so I kind of like try to bunch them up. And then they go away or they become something else. And that's part of the process of like working iteratively versus in a straight line.
That's a great answer.
Matt, I just wanted to note that the artist John Opera is here. He's a professor of photography at UB, and I wanted to introduce him because I know that you share some interests in very experimental photographic processes.
Well, how you doing?
Hi.
I wanted to make sure my question got in tonight. It's exciting to see everyone so interested in your talk, and thank you, by the way, for being here. Super engaging and really generous. Yeah, I guess, and I think it's totally cool you're building a color darkroom.
It's perverse.
Yeah, no, I have a friend who travels to Newburgh to work in her color darkroom from the city. But anyway, I was curious about not really process, because I mean, you did a beautiful job. I just love your language and how you describe what you're doing. It's really beautiful and poetic, and I apologize if this question sounds stiff, but I was jotting down notes during your talk, so I wanted to make sure I'm
turning off myself too, so I didn't see myself.
Yeah.
I can more relax.
But I said, your work has a specific relationship, of course, to process and historical modes of representation, but it's also for me, there's a very specific way in which you deploy specific kinds of images. And I said, image-wise, I'm reminded of artists like Eileen Quinlan or perhaps even David Noonan, where figuration and abstraction play with one another. And like you, these artists have a specific kind of universe of images. When I look at your work, there's a very kind of homogeneous, intuitive, hard to pin down lexicon, but it's there. And I think perhaps you did touch on this and answer it a bit at the end, but curious if you can expand on why your semiotics turn towards cinematic end of the day. Zoom exhaustion here, but why they turn towards those aesthetics specifically? Is it only about the screen and media, or there are other reasons or impulses at play? You mentioned gender, but nostalgia also seems to be kind of floating around in there. And I'm wondering, is this a survey of genre, nod to kitsch? But I guess basically I'm wondering where you are with images, especially in our age where signifiers seem largely bankrupt. Again, I'm just wondering where you are with that. That's a long question.
No, it's a super good question, and I don't know if I can do it.
Yeah, I don't know.
But
that is the question, I guess. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you about what you're saying about images, and I think, well, they're unstable. I don't know that I would say that they're bankrupt, but they get used up and passed around and depleted, and yet I also
maybe hyperbole there, but yeah.
I do have great faith in our in the freshness of our encounter with images. And how I got into film it's just happenstance. It's literally just that I finished school and was living in Boston and got in every night free at the Harvard Film Archive. So the moment when I started to emerged from school was a moment where I was deeply, deeply steeped in film, and it sort of took over my life in some ways. But through it, I feel like I could, I think that I had been very literary. I was very text-based as an undergraduate, and film became this visual text, and like also felt like a vernacular. Like in film, I felt like there was a database of ideas that were non-verbal, that were being passed on, that were being shared. So it was like a common space. It was a space of projection, and I was very, what interested me about those Warhol films was the pressure of the lens, and being, like somebody being asked to perform themselves in some way, and then like the way that sort of pushed out these extremities. But that quickly became about self-reflection and, wondering about one's own performance of oneself. And so I think that I connected to the cinema in a very personal way around what I needed in my 20s. And I ended up in Berlin because of Fassbinder, because I'd been thinking so much about performance and artifice, and I'd always thought about, that I was interested in Mannerist painting in particular, and I was thinking that there was this sort of shared affinity between the archness of a lot of painting that I loved and the complexity of the genre films that Fassbinder was making, and my love of that took me to Germany, and then when you get into nostalgia, that's living in Berlin, and suddenly like having access to these flea markets and this like space to reflect on visual culture from some remove. It was like certainly like a fetish for Weimar and all these things that are the mark of being in my mid-20s and living in Berlin.
Yeah. Sure.
So it's like funny, it's something that's it's allowed me to carry myself through like personal crisis, through reflecting on history, and I don't know where else it goes, and I've struggled around those because I have very specific reasons for talking about certain subjects, but they always end up being kind of the MacGuffins. I feel like, especially earlier on, I would be so excited to explain why I was excited about something, and then people would talk about that like the decoder ring for the work. And in a way, like the work, I'm looking at this person and thinking about this thing, but I'm thinking about it because it's compelling to me in ways that are more generalizable. And I think I've tried to shift the focus away from individual actors and into things that are more process-based as a way to not get bogged down in endless anecdote about.
The image is still there.
And
talking about Fassbinder too, I'm reminded of World on a Wire, or these, this simulation or kind of the universe of images, or the universe of simulacra versus.
And Fassbinder is so interesting because it's the most overcooked, artificial, it's the most mannered of that
a lot of manners
anywhere else, and it's in a way the most like, I mean, I know not for everybody, but for me it's the most mannered, and yet it gets the rawest. It has this, it speaks to something about that connection between extreme artifice and extreme vulnerability that I always found really compelling.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks. Thank you.
The bigger question. There are hands up. I don't know. Can Max see?
I have a question, and it's funny because it kind of it follows what John was saying, and then when you bring up Fassbinder, I started laughing because I was thinking about Bergman and persona, and how romantic all of the imagery that you're making is in such a strange way. Like there's this urgency to it. Like there are these, you talk about your practice like you're talking about someone that you have a long-standing romantic relationship. That there's kind of an urgency, and I'm finding it really interesting, the relationship between the romantic and the ineffable. And you're talking about the ineffable, this moment where you keep missing, that breathlessness that happens in the interim. I'm finding really, really interesting because it's really, really well reflected in the quality of the images. It's very, very well reflected in that when you talk about instability, right? That you know, that it's the, you know, it's the crazy, right? It's the irresistible nature of the thing which you desire, and that nature of desire, of course, is that which can never be achieved. So there's a really, you know, when you're showing this sort of more intimate images, I'm really struck by how you relate to your practice almost like a lover. And then that's when I started thinking about persona and Bergman, and the whole thing kind of like, I was like, oh, you know, like there was a really interesting moment there.
Yeah, I mean, that's so wonderful that you get that. That makes me feel better about. Yes, of course. I did. I mean, we all have sublimations and transpositions, but if you're not in a romantic relationship with your practice, I don't know what you're doing.
But it's volatile.
Yeah, it is volatile. It's and then you always, I think it's also right now because I'm like, I've displaced my habits somehow, like not just COVID, but I'm on sabbatical this year, so I'm not in Boston, and I've like rented a new studio, and I was supposed to go back to Berlin, and I can't go there. So I think I'm in this moment of renegotiating my own, like, what's next, you know. And so that's a very volatile moment. It must come up in my manner. But yeah, I think that I've struggled more recently. I've looked for language, and I've had to write a little bit about the emotional pitch of the work, which I recognize is always there, and yet
fevered in a lot of places, you know, and there are these, you know, there are definite correlations with this nature of relationships as never being a stable entity, you know, that you know, when Merleau-Ponty talks about that mutual violation that happens, you know, in the phenomena of the artist engaging with the audience, and that third thing that gets created that becomes its own thing.
Yeah.
And, you know, and having a relationship with that is a recipe for heartbreak.
Yeah. No. Yes. And I mean, I'm someone who lives with a lot of art, and like really believes, when I refer to the painting itself as a body, I do believe that these things, when they're alive, continue to speak to you every day in different changing ways, and in exhibitions and in art making in the contemporary art market, we think of these like slam bam, you know, you make your work, it goes on the wall, you have the show. And I think I really have tried to make work that really like asks to be needier, or to give.
It asks more of the audience.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm successful at that, but
it's a strange participation that you're inviting that I don't see very often in painting or in photography. That, you know, that the invitation that you create by virtue of what your process is tends to have it lands in an emotional way, and that's unusual to me because it feels real. And so going back to that idea of persona, going back to the idea of, like, you know, the construction of self. And when you speak about the construction of self, there is always that moment in which you fall out of love with yourself and then strive to become someone else. And so much of that is embodied in the work. And it really, I was not prepared to be quite as affected as I was by what you were doing. And now I'm sort of dazzled, like I have a crush, you know, like a visual crush, like I feel it as it translates into the surface. Now I want to see them for real. I want to see them in front of me, like, you know, and that is exciting to me. I like when that happens.
That's great. I'm very happy about everything you just said. I won't try to say anything else. I'll just thank you. No, that really that's great to hear all that. I'm glad that is coming through to you. I know it doesn't come through to everybody, but I'm glad that it's there because it.
Kind of a, yeah, I tend to be sensitive to that kind of thing to begin with.
So, I mean, though that might be a great way to end any presentation, I don't want to cut anybody off, or Matt, I don't want to like interrupt any flow of thoughts and ideas and conversation. Does anyone have any additional questions to follow up before? Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, hi, Sarah. Hi.
Hey, Matt. I got to meet Matt earlier today and talk with him, and this has been really, really fantastic because you say so much that really, I feel so much of what you're saying, and I want so much of that in my own work, and so that's really fascinating to me. I wanted to know in terms of materials, because there's a connection between your materials and what you want. When you work on your paintings, do they have that same sort of movement and kind of disorientation that the photographic paintings then have?
I think they do through what they have to perform later. That I'm always trying to understand how thin the paint is, and I'm like part of the pleasure is working backwards. You know, when I didn't belabor how I started working on these photos in the first place, but the first one was not really meant to be a photo. It was kind of like a conceptual project of making a negative by hand. And, but the drawing of it became so fascinating because everything got flipped in this way. And I was like, so with the color ones, especially, I look at a source image, or even sometimes I have ideas like that I want to do, but I don't flip it in the computer. So I don't give myself the color to match. So I'm always trying to think, what's the opposite of that green?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's like, you know, it's like I've got a repertoire now where I can get it closer to right when I want, but there's something of like never being able to see the painting when you're making it because you know that it's going to like turn over. And so you're always, and I think that that's how I keep that kind of slipperiness. Or that,
okay.
My attraction to that slipperiness in an image is what makes this way of working in negative so attractive to me, because I like kind of like being a little bit blind. I really like.
Yeah, not always knowing where it's going.
I can look at it, I can think about it.
Yeah.
It's always going to be something else, and that's really exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
That reminds me of a comment that I read in an interview with you where you say something about needing to or wanting to paint the opposite of what you, or I guess how you put it is that you have to paint the opposite of what you want.
Yeah.
Which you go on to talk about this idea of like being veiled from something known and being open to the experiment, but being able to establish the opposite indicates that you do know, you know, kind of something that it would be oppositional to the known, like you have some framework for it. And I think it was there's an image that you showed, a C print that has a kind of frame that looks like a volumetric frame around it, like almost like a staging. It reminded me a little bit, even, and it might be a stretch, but a little bit of Francis Bacon, this kind of idea of like something that establishes composition in something that's really amorphous. And it seemed like to me anyway, an image that's like almost a clue to your thinking in that sense, like being in and out of the frame, or, you know, once you put a frame around something, at least for me, it makes me immediately very curious about what's not in that frame and, you know, where the borders start to bleed into other spaces.
Yeah. I just had something that may not, for all the painters out there, one of the revelations for me with color photography was you have no light in the dark room. And you know, in a black and white lab, you've got the safe light, but in color, you're really in pitch black. And I hadn't accounted for that. So I took the painting off the stretcher, I put it on the table, and then I didn't know which way was up. And so I was there in the dark, and I think I probably spent a half an hour just feeling my painting, trying to read it with my fingers. And that was an incredibly weird and powerful experience, which I recommend it. Like, take one of your paintings, put the lights out, and see if you could see the painting with your hands. Because that was one of the sort of discoveries for me, was just a big, the ones that are really like thrown and kind of like folded over, a lot of that has to do with having developed a kind of haptic relationship to those paintings, because I was always trying to orient them by touch and remember where the thick and thin parts were and whatever. And it's just really great to find ways to change your relationship with the work. You've made it, you know it, but then suddenly it's completely strange to you and you've got to feel it in a different way.
Hey, Matt, could I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing. Your work's really mesmerizing. I love it on so many different levels. I'd be really curious to hear you talk about how you conceptualize the relationship between form and content within your work.
I don't think they're really separable. I think that definitely the ways that, I kept using these phrases, I guess, like using the painting just as a tool or potential energy. Part of that is about like part of that is like trying to keep forms in play up until the very last minute. And if what I'm trying to make an image of is a kind of shifting or distanced or complicated relationship, the form has to be involved in generating that. That didn't really make any sense, but there's something, I think there's something true in what I'm trying to say for myself, that by working with the materials in the way that I do, I'm not allowing those things to separate out. That so much of like what the materiality of the thing is affects what the image is. Anything that seems sort of immaterial about it can never be divorced from the fact that this is thick linen and I use Rebeskin glue, and so that these painting forms, technical or visual, are like always folded together. Because I don't have a lot of, I'm of the generation that still used illustrative as a kind of pejorative word. So I always was very allergic to this idea of like illustrating your idea. It's like, I prefer the idea of embodying your idea. And then it's made physical. And then how is that not intimately seated with the idea? I don't know if that.
Great, thank you, yes.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
I wanted to make a couple of comments because, a comment, because I'm really, after seeing like the lecture and you answered one of Brooke's question, and I just found it amazing on how like you tried to capture something like whatever you're trying to capture in your works, and I thought that was really interesting to me, because that's what one of the things that fascinates me is human emotion, and I consider myself more of a musician, and I try to capture that in my music and a little bit in the art that I do dabble in. And I've never really considered the mediums that you have done to try to do the same exact thing, because it's not something I've really seen before until now, actually. So the way you've explained what you're doing has just been like really amazing to hear about.
It's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm with you about human emotion.
Some of the things that I did see was like that a lot of your works do, I thought they lended themselves into like darker themes, where I saw the art had a lot of, for me, it was like they portrayed anxiety, angst, and stuff like that. And they said, but I wanted something that I asked earlier is how they could like lend themselves towards brighter themes, because that's something that I really enjoy capturing. So I did see one of your works that really like just stuck out to me, where I think it was in your hybrid section, where it was a picture of a person it was the picture of their back, and it sort of lit up, and it represented hope to me in a sort of way.
I guess I do tend towards the darker, or the longing or kind of distance, but yeah, there are a few works I didn't show of people hanging out on the beach and I mean, not to be shy, but yeah, I'll go back and think about that work in particular, and the fact that, and then you seeing that as a hopeful thing, because of course that's really interesting feedback. I'm really, I don't trust that you ever know how people are going to feel about something. That I've had things that I've thought were completely sweet that have seemed monstrous or unsettling to people, and so I always am asking people how they feel in front of the work. So that's really, I'm glad to hear from you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have we overlooked any questions? I hope not.
I see one, right.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
yeah.
It's more like I want to like share like my thoughts, and maybe like I just want to see what your feedback would be. So I was looking at the animation. It was just like a little glimpse of it, and I remember you were talking about your snapshots and how your processes, sometimes you see the same thing over and over, and like filmmaking comes across, and like you're trying to establish like the opposite. So I was thinking like, what kind of self-portrait would you make? And then I was thinking of animation, and I'm like, maybe the way he's feeling or thinking, that's a different kind of way of self-portrait. I don't know if that makes sense. So you're like, we're seeing you by the animation, but it's representational because you're not creating an object, but with the imagery that you're making, like the object comes alive, but it's like your thought process.
That's beautiful. Yeah,
I love that, and I couldn't refrain like my thoughts, and I'm like, I'm just gonna say that way.
No, thank you. That's great. That's beautiful. Yeah, there's something I often say that my animations are my drawing practice, and that includes the idea that they feel more personal. Even, I mean, which is a weird thing to say because if you saw them, they wouldn't feel that way. But I do them daily. I build them like. I guess I realized today in the visits that I had, I was raging against storyboards, and yeah, I make drawings, and I make like passages of animation in sort of fragments sitting at the kitchen table over time, and then I put them together, and they usually mark the shows. Like I usually finish about one animation a year, and it usually is like I end up referring to that entire period of time or that whole body of work usually by the name of that animation. So I guess it's become kind of like the metronome or the diary of how I'm feeling or thinking. And I never thought of it as a self-portrait, but there's something interesting and right about what you're proposing.
It's like a time lapse, like because I saw like a blink of an eye, like a snapshot, like blinking. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Time is amazing. Time is amazing.
Yeah.
That's my deep thought for the night. Thank you. Yeah.
Well,
thanks everyone for all your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and presenting this work. And I also want to thank Margaret Lee for joining us tonight, and all of you for your questions and your thoughtfulness. I think it was a really great evening. So we thank you.
Everyone. It was really great to. It's nice to meet you all. I hope I actually get to meet you all.
Yeah, we have to get you to come to the actual campus one day in the future.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
I like your work.
Yes, it was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Intermax, if I should leave.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah.
You.
Okay.